One of the things that's most important to me is giving police officers the tools that they need to do their job well, to do it safely, and also to make sure that they're connected with and understand the community. So today I want to tell you the story of a black child with schizophrenia. So he was 6 years old. His life had gone well to that point, as well as a 6-year-old's life can go. And he had these weird little things about him. Like, for instance, when he was 2, 3 years old, he never wanted to get out of his car seat. He slept in his car seat. That was where he felt safe. He would sit in the back of the car and somehow take off his clothes and still leave his seatbelt on and throw his shoes out the window. And then he goes to school. He does well in school. He learns how to read, he walks. He was a little premature, but good kid. All of a sudden, he's 6 years old, he gets a call. His mother gets a call from his school saying, "Your son keeps walking into the closet and he won't come out." So my thing was, get him out, because this is my son. Get him out. What's wrong? Why is he in the closet? Time goes on and he starts running around the school, and he starts trying to leave the school, and he starts yelling about the teachers hating him. And I'm like, there has to be some truth to it, because he would cry and he would hurt so badly that this is not a lie. So the school and I sat down one day and we decided to watch the video, because whatever teacher that was causing this needs to be held accountable. As we watched the video, we saw him walking through the halls arguing with no one. We saw him sitting in his classroom, get up, throw his pencil down, walk into the closet, bang on the closet door saying, "Why won't you let me out?" when no one told him to go in the closet. We saw him stab himself in the hand with a pencil and then cry because he was blaming the boy who sat next to him for doing it, but there was no boy sitting next to him. So the school immediately misidentified him as having ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. He's just a bad kid. He's oppositional, he doesn't respect authority. And I said, that's not true, because at home, he's so helpful. And he basically does anything I tell him to do, almost annoyingly so. So how is he oppositional? And other teachers said, no, on most days he listens, he helps, he wants to help other students. And so one day, he went to school and he sat on the principal's lap. I had taken him to several different schools. And finally I said, you know what? I'm going to take him to Christian school, because they have patience, they're kind, it's a smaller school setting, they might be able to give him the support that he needs. I left him at school, he started screaming, and he started fighting, and she calls me up, and she says, you have to come. I get there, and he's sitting on the principal's lap, where he urinated on her lap at 7 years old, because he was terrified. That point, started taking him back and forth to the hospital. There's something wrong, in and out of psychiatric treatment facilities. And they went back and forth, and at 7.5 years old, he was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. But they still didn't think it was really schizoaffective, because schizoaffective disorder, there's components of schizophrenia, but then there's a mood element that changes. So they said he doesn't really have the mood element, but he's so young. We don't usually diagnose this so young. As time went on, it became very clear that he was schizophrenic, paranoid type. He was in and out of treatments. To date, he's had about 22 hospitalizations. He has been in residential treatment facilities. Out of 16 years of his life, I would say at least 9 of them, in and out. He's been on every type of medication, and finally we found one that really, really works for him. But it doesn't work completely, because even today, he's having a hard time. He has a lot of inpatient therapy. He has an inpatient in-home therapist, outpatient, who comes to the house twice a week. He has a mentor that comes to the house twice a week. He has a psychiatrist. He has a social support team. He works with Department of Mental Health. He has so many supports, and he goes to a wonderful school that has therapists and psychiatrists and all of these things different that are there for him. So even with all of that, what we find is 85% of the time, he's doing well. 15% of the time, he's facing some of the most scary challenges that anyone can face. Imagine walking through the world terrified. Every time you see a camera, somebody's watching you. Every time somebody holds up a cell phone to take a selfie, they're trying to take a picture of you. Every time you see somebody in a uniform, you think they're getting ready to arrest you. Well, a lot of people have that. But for him, it's terrifying. He doesn't like to be around little kids because their movements are unpredictable. So wherever he goes, we try to make sure that there's not too many little kids. He doesn't like to be in rooms more than 10 people. He's gotten to the point now that 85% of the time, he can do well in those rooms with larger people, but he sits back in a way. He has auditory hallucination, meaning he hears voices. He hears various things. He has visual hallucinations, which means he sees things. He has tactile hallucinations, which means he feels things. So he might not see the spider crawling on him, but he feels like there's spiders crawling on him. He might not see somebody touch him, but he feels somebody's touching him. He's definitely paranoid, as I've explained. And then he has dissociation, which means sometimes he does stuff and he doesn't realize he's doing it. He thinks somebody else is doing it, or he just doesn't remember it at all. All of this led to my work as an advocate for those with mental illness. I'm on the board of directors of NAMI Central Mass, specifically working with law enforcement to do more to help train them for dealing with mentally ill people in the community. So why do officers need training? The main component is, why set officers up for failure? In my situation, I'm dealing with an African American, a black child, who's quickly becoming a black man. So one thing that's important is show the community, especially the African American community, that there's a real investment in their safety and our safety. That shows, by training law enforcement, that shows the community that law enforcement truly cares and is willing to put their money with their heart. It decreases the unnecessary arrest and incarceration of people with behavioral conditions. While the prevalence of mental illness for blacks are the exact same as the prevalence for any other race, we do find that blacks have 20% more likelihood of having more serious mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, and other illnesses such as that. So if police officers are not properly trained, imagine they're being put in a situation with media all over them, everybody with a cell phone, everybody watching for the next time a law enforcement officer mistakenly or not attacks, as the community sees it, an African American, especially an African American male. Why put officers in that predicament to even find out later that that person was mentally ill? Certain actions from an untrained officer might actually cause and aggravate that person, might cause a worse situation. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more shortly. It's a problem of perception. Police officers need to be trained that it's not personal. The person's actions, the mentally ill person's actions, is not personal toward law enforcement. It's their perception of the world around them. Being schizophrenic not only changes the way my son and other people see the world, but it also changes how the world responds to them. Because they're reacting to the world with fear, so the world is returning that energy with more fear. Proper response requires training and scenario. Again, why should we set officers up for failure? Think about what could happen. My biggest fear is that one day my son has a very bad day. He's out without me. Law enforcement don't realize that he's mentally ill. They don't realize that he's paranoid. They don't realize that he can't be touched when he's upset like that. And what could potentially happen if a law enforcement officer is not trained? My son's worst day could become his last day. So what do? I teach, I educate, I help train, I speak about this, because the only way to stop instances like this is to be proactive, not to wait until somebody's child dies or until somebody's husband or wife dies and then say there's outrage, we have to do something. So I work proactively. Family fears, most family fears are that the actions, like I said, of the person are misinterpreted, that the stigmas of mental illness will create a response that's not necessarily consistent with the expectations, that officers will lack compassion. That I don't find to be true. Most officers who actually realize and are trained to understand what goes on are actually some of the most compassionate members in the community when it comes to mental illness. Because mental illness touches every family, regardless of gender, race, religion. It touches across the board. Then there is race. Because you can't ignore race when we have a racial climate right now where our country, our world is torn apart and people are separated and segregated and hurt or hurting because of race. So why set the police officers up to be in a position, regardless of the race of the officer, regardless of the gender of the officer, to be in a position where they're facing my worst day, my son's worst day, and on top of that, the media's criticism that did they respond properly to a young African American male? So here's some things that an officer should know. Don't move quickly toward the person. Announce your movements. Move slowly. Let them know why you're moving and what your intentions are. Don't touch the person in keeping with the first without announcing your intentions. I'm going to reach out my hand now. Can I touch your shoulder? I'm going to touch your arm. To give them that few millisecond lead to know that the officer is not about to attack them And it also creates a rapport. Whether or not it seems like that person is listening or not, you never know what's going to get through. Make sure the person is actually understanding your directives. Because in understanding those directives, sometimes they hear you, but they don't understand, and they might do the opposite. So are they being combative? Look in their eyes. They might have a distant look that lets you know they're not really in the moment. Put out all the lights, all the noise, silence radios. All of those things can be triggering to a person, especially a schizophrenic, with any person with mental illness. Explain while any communication is going on. Explain that the walkie-talkie is just to help them communicate, to help you communicate so that the officer can better take care of that person. Explain why there might be cameras, that the cameras are not some attack against them, or their picture isn't going to be sold, or it's going to be put on the internet, or what have you. Just take the time to explain. Watch for any sudden movements. And again, remember, it's about perception, not intent. It's that person's worst day. It's not their everyday. They're having a moment. A few things that the family can do: communicate specifics to the officers in a calm manner. Yelling and screaming at the officer or anybody in the community is only going to make that mentally ill person, especially a schizophrenic, more agitated. So it's up to the family members or the community support to remain calm. Offer support to the officer. Ask the officer, what can I do to support you in this situation so that my loved one can be safe? Because running up in that situation can, again, put you, the officer, and the loved one in danger. Have numbers of the treatment team ready. Know whether that person is taking their medicine and what medication they're on, because if they're not compliant to their medication, then that will let you know how much of this can be decreased and de-escalated in that moment. If they're off their meds, then not very much most of the time. Call an outpatient crisis intervention team, even if you call law enforcement. Don't leave it all on law enforcement to be the mental illness experts. They're not. Even if they're trained, they're not mental illness experts. So call the crisis intervention team so that they can support law enforcement, support the family, and support the mentally ill individual. Have an emergency plan, and most importantly, stay safe. So what are some next steps? As I conclude, next steps are doing things like going on in Massachusetts and all around the country. Police officers need crisis intervention training and their teams so that they understand how to specifically go into these situations and how to respond. And in those should be scenarios, just as the scenarios that we do with active shooters or terrorism or domestic violence situations. There should be scenarios where you're on how to de-escalate a situation dealing with somebody with mental illness. There should be special courts for mental illness, just like there's family courts and drug courts and traffic courts. Special diversion teams, and partnering officers with advocates or trained mental illness professionals when they're going into that situation, and anything else that we can do. So in conclusion, again, it's all about perception. My son's worst day is about perception. He perceives everybody as being against him. On his good day, he doesn't care. He's not violent. He doesn't want any trouble. He stays to himself. He tries to do anything that keeps peace in a situation. So don't listen to the movies. Don't listen to the horror stories or the books or the comic books that say everybody with schizophrenia is trying to kill people, because that's not true. And everybody who does something wrong doesn't have a mental illness. And that is the way we start to educate our community, and most important, educate and train our law enforcement. Thank you.